Hi, everyone. Good to see you again. I'm Kirsten, back to talk about renewable energy. We like to show this cartoon. It gives some good perspective on the significance of fossil fuels in human history. Fossil fuels, they dominate our energy mix today, but that wasn't always necessarily the case and is not always going to be the case. And this chart, I think you've seen it before, potentially in the first class. It shows that our world has gone through several eras when it comes to the energy resources that primarily make up our energy mix. From one, reliant on biomass, to one where coal played a really big role within our energy mix. The most recent era really where oil and gas dominated, and now we're in this era where renewable energy makes up a relatively small portion of our global energy mix, but is growing really, really significantly, those colorful portions of the chart at the top. And if you look at predictions for where we're going in the future, we see a continuation and acceleration of this renewable energy growth in our energy mix. You've seen this before. It's from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. It shows specifically our electricity mix, not energy overall, but electricity, as you know, is playing a bigger and bigger role in our overall energy mix because of the roles, this really impactful role, significant role that renewable energy is playing. So today, in this Introduction to Renewable Energy course, we're going to talk about what renewable energy is and the role that it plays in our energy mix. And then we're going to walk through the renewable energy project development process. And in so doing, give you guys a sense of what are some of the challenges, but also drivers of renewable energy growth in our energy mix. So we hear the term renewable energy a lot, but it's a fairly broad term. A lot of people think renewable means inexhaustible. Replenishes in a human's timescale. That's not necessarily always the case, but it is the case for some renewable energy resources. People also associate the term renewable energy with clean energy. Again, by and large, renewable energy fares better on the environmental scorecard than fossil fuels, but not always. And so, renewable energy, it's a fairly broad term that encompasses a lot of different resources that are actually very diverse and don't have a lot in common. There can be certainly some commonalities. Most renewable energy resources, like we talked about, have lower environmental impacts. They typically have no fuel cost because their fuel just comes from the environment, like the wind blowing or the sun shining. But there, typically might be higher gathering costs associated with that in the form of, say, transmission to transmit wind energy from the windiest parts of the country to areas of demand. So these are some commonalities, and rules of thumb, but there are also exceptions. But in general, what we call renewable energy resources, they vary quite significantly when it comes to their environmental impact, their economics, what scale they can be deployed at, their end uses, how significant they are in our energy mix, and whether or not they're growing, and what type of technology is being used. In terms of technology used, just to give you a few examples, you have everything from turbines for hydroelectricity generation, to turbines for wind electricity generation, to the PN junction for solar electricity. There are also different end uses, like you see in the primary application column, in terms of heat, electricity, and transportation. And there are some instances where you have a really old technology that's been around for over a century, like with hydroelectric dams, or newer technologies when you're talking about, as you learned about in Diana's lecture, third generation biofuels or perovskites for solar panels. Even within each energy resource category, you have a lot of variability. For example, we're gonna talk about solar on Friday. Within the solar energy resource, you can have everything from installing a window to take advantage of solar heat and light directly, to harnessing the sun's energy for electricity through the photovoltaic technology. So lots of variability. let's dig into some of these kind of characteristics and categories for how we might define renewable energy. So typically, when we think about renewable energy resources, we think about the resources shown in blue on this slide. Their origins, they largely come from the sun, with two exceptions, geothermal and tides. Geothermal's origins come from heat from the Earth's core, and tides are primarily driven by the gravitational pull of the moon. As I mentioned, many people think that renewable energy is inexhaustible and not depletable, but it's important to think about renewable energy in terms of a spectrum. Some of these resources can actually be depleted faster than we can use them. So these resources, now that you see with the lighter blue coloring, are considered depletable within even human time frames. So with traditional biomass, to use an oversimplified example, if you cut a tree down and burn it for heat, you can't use that tree again, right? Hydro can also be depleted. Once you cycle water through a turbine to generate electricity, that potential energy is gone, unless you use energy again to pump that water back up into a higher reservoir. And if you take a step back, rising temperatures can have the potential to deplete hydro resources in a particular region, like we're seeing in the Southwest, in the Colorado River. With geothermal energy, in order to harness that geothermal resource, the heat from the Earth's core, you need a heat transfer mechanism, a heat transfer fluid like steam or water. So this is one of the reasons why geothermal is called a hydrothermal resource. So as you extract the geothermal resource from a reservoir, you can actually deplete that water or steam from that reservoir, which depletes your ability to continue to extract that resource. So oftentimes, if you look at a geothermal project or reservoir, electricity production over time, you can see it declining unless a project re-injects water or another heat transfer fluid back into the reservoir. And then you have the fully depletable resources in gray, like the fossil fuels that take tens to hundreds of millions of years to form, and so they're considered finite in terms of human timescales. And really important to remember that energy efficiency should be considered both a supply-side resource and a demand-side resource when we're thinking about energy resources. So in this course, we group renewable energy into three different categories. The first is energy efficiency, because the cheapest and the cleanest kilowatt hour or therm is the one that you don't use in the first place. And because of this, energy efficiency should be prioritized first, right? You know, if you're going to put solar panels on somebody's roof, it's really important to conduct an energy audit and reduce the demand of that household so that you don't oversize your system and pay for more solar panels than you actually need. So energy efficiency comes first and is in its own category. You've got then the truly renewable energy resources, the wind, solar, and ocean resources that are basically inexhaustible. And then the third category is those semi-renewable energy resources, where if not managed correctly, they can be depleted. These are hydro, geothermal, and biomass. All right, you guys have seen this before. This diagram, it depicts the economically recoverable resource available for each energy resource worldwide relative to global energy consumption. On the left, you've got the finite stock resources, and the size of the resource shown depicts the absolute resource that's available. And on the right, you've got the flow resources that depict the amount of resource that's available on an annual basis. And you can see the solar resource really dwarfs both global energy demand and all other energy resources. So there's a lot of variability in the resource that's available, even within the renewable energy resources. A lot of the other renewable energy resources have the potential to play a much more significant role in our energy mix than they do today, but you can see that by and large, their ability to play a significant role in our energy mix is somewhat limited. To give you a sense of what this means in the US context, the technically recoverable wind resource has the potential to meet our electricity needs 8 times over. In the case of solar, that's 75 times over. So lots of wind and solar resource to meet our energy needs. But in the case of geothermal and biomass, in the US, each only has the potential to meet about 8% of our electricity needs. There's also a lot of variability in terms of economics of renewable energy resources. This is the levelized cost of energy analysis from Lazard that you've seen so much in this class that show the cost of each electricity resource normalized based on megawatt hours, normalized based on production. And you can see that renewable energy makes up some of the most expensive resources with rooftop solar in particular. But renewable energy also makes up some of the cheapest resources, like utility scale solar and utility scale wind energy. Not even within renewable energy, but also taking into account the fossil fuels. Renewable energy makes up some of the cheapest. But one of the challenges, as you guys learned with the LCOE, is it doesn't necessarily depict other considerations and other value considerations associated with these resources. For example, solar has a different generation profile than geothermal, right? Solar can only be generated when the sun is shining during the day. And because of that, we have what we know as the duck curve challenge of meeting significant amounts of demand during peak periods of demand during the day, simultaneous to when the sun is setting and solar generation is declining. So to give you a sense of what this means in terms of economics, generally contract prices for solar, utility scale solar, we see at about $50 to $60 a megawatt hour. Contract prices for firm geothermal are going to be about $85 to $100 a megawatt hour. So that gives you a sense of the value that electricity stakeholders are willing to pay for firm power. There's also a lot of variability in our renewable energy resources when it comes to their environmental impacts. We talked about the fact that it's important to consider environmental impacts throughout the life cycle of energy resources, and that there's no free lunch, right? Every energy resource has environmental impacts that must be managed. All human activity has environmental impacts, right? And we have to think about those. So you've seen this chart that shows greenhouse gas emissions, life cycle greenhouse gas emissions for different electricity generation resources, and that there is a lot of variability. With hydropower, for example, that if you have a dam, that flooding of vegetation can release significant amounts of methane, which is why you have that big range of GHG emissions here. And with biomass too, depending on the feedstock, those can have significant greenhouse gas emissions. Again, with water resources, this is a reminder from the environment lecture. This chart shows water use intensity of different energy resources that's normalized based on the role within their energy mix. And you can see that renewable energy resources, wind and solar, make up use the least amount of water, but renewable energy resources like geothermal, ethanol, and hydropower also use the most water. And again, another big environmental impact to think about with renewable energy resources and other associated technologies like batteries that go into electric vehicles and that help balance renewable energy on the grid. They're very minerals intensive, and that minerals mining process can disrupt land use and contaminate water, and can often come from portions of the world that use questionable labor practices, like child labor. So all things that we need to think about in terms of managing renewable energy environmental impacts, but ultimately, and manage as we scale up renewable energy in our energy mix as a fundamentally important climate solution. So this is the chart that depicts a scenario from Project Drawdown of how we can tackle climate emissions using economically viable solutions. And you can see energy solutions, and in particular wind and solar electricity, energy efficiency, play a really big role in driving solutions towards a low carbon future. Okay, so we just talked about what renewable energy is and how there's a lot of diversity. Let's talk about the role that renewable energy plays in our energy system today. So renewable energy resources, they make up a relatively small portion of our global and US energy mix. As you can see on the top pie charts there, the blue represents the renewable energy. But they play a bigger role in our electricity mix because electricity isn't a big source of transportation fuel, at least today. We know that's growing with vehicle electrification. One of the things that those pie charts don't show is the use of traditional biomass in our energy mix. So globally, as you learned in the biomass lecture, biomass is actually the primary renewable energy resource that's used in making up about 7% of global energy consumption. And this is largely in the developing world, the use of wood and dung for cooking and for heat by about a third of the world's population, which has significant negative implications when it comes to health, when it comes to economic development, and the environment. So because one, it's hard to measure, but two, because it's not really considered a renewable energy resource, because of all the challenges and negative implications of biomass, it's not really included in a lot of the charts like these that you see from the IEA and the EIA. And here from REN 21, which was a recommended reading, you can see that this has just been in the last couple of years. They distinguish between the modern renewable energy resources and then other. So the modern renewable energy doesn't include biomass, and it's included in that other category up there. All right, so renewable energy, relatively small portion of our energy mix, but the fastest growing. Wind and solar, that's included in the other renewables and make up the biggest portion of the other renewables on this chart, are the fastest growing energy resources worldwide. And the growth of wind and solar today is largely driven by their competitive economics, market forces really driving adoption. Because by and large, in the majority of the world, wind and solar, not just in the US, but elsewhere, wind and solar are the lowest cost electricity resources. And this is a relatively recent phenomenon. Wind and solar costs have come down quite significantly in the past 2 decades, with wind's decline in costs happening earlier than solar. Solar was more recent. And this has been because of technology innovations, things like wind turbines getting taller, the blades getting longer, and increasing production as a result, productivity. These wind turbines are like the height of a football field. It's really, really cool to be standing next to. And they weren't always that way, right? When I was growing up and we'd drive through the Altamont Pass to get to my family's ranch, the wind turbines were like, 30 feet tall. And they were like these rickety old lattice type structures. With solar PV panels too, their efficiencies have increased with R&D and innovation over time. And even more recently, we've seen technology to put PV technology on the back of solar panels to collect additional reflected light that also increases productivity. So lots of innovation that's continuing to drive these costs down. You can see this uptick in that happened in 2022. This is largely a result of a combination of supply chain constraints that was affecting, economy-wide, but also trade wars that we're seeing continue today with China, given China's significant role in solar panel production. That's something we'll dive into more on in Friday's solar lecture. As we're seeing growth of renewable energy, we're seeing grid operators increasingly integrate more and more renewable energy on the grid, despite the intermittency challenges that we've talked about with the duck curve. And this is because, as we talked about in the grid lecture, grid operators have a lot of tools at their disposal to continue to integrate more and more renewable energy, everything from flexible generation resources like natural gas and batteries to demand side solutions like demand response and managing EV charging to broader kind of market solutions like regional integration and expanding competitive electricity markets, those RTOs and ISOs. So we're going to continue to see more and more renewable energy in portions of our electricity mix as renewable energy grows. We're also seeing significant investments from the private sector into renewable energy resources to the point where what this chart from Bloomberg New Energy Finance on the right shows, it shows the ratio of global investments in low carbon energy solutions versus fossil fuels. And we're at a point where that ratio in 2022 was 0.9. So we've probably already gotten to the point where global investments in low carbon energy resources have outstripped investments in fossil fuels. So that's a huge shift and milestone from the investment sector. Zeroing in on the US, we're seeing large amounts of wind and solar being built on the grid. By and large, new capacity additions on the grid are wind and solar, and to a lesser extent, natural gas, and also batteries. This chart, it shows you capacity additions on the grid. This chart zeroes in on electricity generation of our renewable energy resources. And here you can really see how we've got these hockey stick type curves with wind and solar generation, while the other renewable energy resources have largely remained fairly constant. So remember, all of our renewable energy resources trace their origins to the sun, or most of them do. And with wind, the wind regime, the dominant factor driving that is temperature differentials. And if you have rising temperatures across the US, you have less temperature differential and less wind. So that's the experience that we saw in 2022, largely attributed to climate change, as Diana mentioned. Yeah, it's interesting. A lot more renewable energy projects are procuring climate-related insurance, and they're finding it harder and harder to get that insurance. So oftentimes they have to self-insure. Whether you're talking about decreased wind generation or increased flood risk for solar panels, things like that. And that's relevant to all infrastructure projects, not just renewable energy. So we often see those up and to the right curves for wind and solar, but it's harder to show those up and to the right curves with energy efficiency, but they are happening. It's important to remember that energy efficiency too has played a really significant role in reducing our energy usage and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and also decoupling it from GDP. Energy efficiency, it's often overlooked because it's harder to measure, but it's a really significant opportunity and an energy resource that needs to be considered. Whether you're talking about transportation efficiency, industrial operations efficiency, or building efficiency, from lighting to energy efficient HVAC. These charts, they show you how economic growth has been quite effectively decoupled from energy usage across the world. And in the US, there have been multiple studies that show that the primary source of reductions in carbon intensity since the 1970s has come from energy efficiency. And another result of kind of the growth in renewable energy and clean energy resources that we're seeing happen that we've discussed, I think Zach has discussed, I talked about in the grid lecture, is this big focus on electrification and electrifying everything. Because we're able to quite effectively decarbonize our electricity mix, and it's much harder to decarbonize other fuels like oil and diesel. The way that we can decarbonize those end uses is through electrification. Another big driver of renewable energy growth that we're seeing in the US, but also in many countries around the world is policy and policy support. I want to emphasize that the primary source of growth that we're seeing, the fundamental growth, is from those competitive economics. But we've seen policy come in and layer on top of that, as we do in many sectors, to help accelerate that growth and also make sure it's happening in a way that meets various social and policy objectives. In the US, as you know, we had landmark legislation in 2022 with the Inflation Reduction Act, and also prior to that with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the CHIPS and Science Act, really channeling significant amounts of federal funding to support that renewable energy growth. And in terms of where renewable energy is heading in the future, this chart, it shows IEA's predictions of solar capacity additions for the world. And actual growth has really blown past predictions. IEA has continually underestimated the potential for change. And it's a reminder that, when we think about where we're going and where our energy mix is heading, we often underestimate that capacity for change, and can only really envision kind of incremental change into the future. These two photos, they show New York's Fifth Avenue on Easter morning, just 13 years apart in 1900 and 1913. And you can see how quickly that transition from horse-drawn carriage to the automobile really happened. And we're in the midst of a transition like this when it comes to renewable energy and low carbon sources in our energy mix. All right, so let's walk through the renewable energy project development process. And in particular, we're going to talk about the process for developing a utility scale wind and a utility scale solar project, because that's, as we've talked about, largely what's being built today. So this is a bird's eye view of that process. The main steps in that utility scale renewable energy project's life: you've got development, construction, and operation. The development phase of a renewable energy project, there are a lot of components to it. It can take everything, everywhere from a year to 10 years to develop a project, maybe even longer, for example, if transmission is taking a really long time to come online. Once development is complete, then the construction phase starts, the EPC, engineering, procurement, and construction. That can take, about 12 months, give or take, depending on the size and the type of the project. And once a project is up and running, it can operate for 30 years. 10 years may seem like a long time for project development, but it's not uncommon when you're talking about an infrastructure project, a big infrastructure project, given the interconnection and permitting processes and the time that those types of things take. And compared to building a new coal and nuclear power plant, it's actually relatively really short. I think one of two nuclear power plants that have come online in the last couple decades, the Tennessee's Watts Bar nuclear reactor, took 43 years to build. It came online in 2015, 7 times over the original budget. And that was in part because, there are a lot of factors that go into it, but with Fukushima, there were a lot of new safety requirements put in place for nuclear power plants, so a lot of new permits and other factors that needed to get incorporated into the project. But we've seen that, in the history of nuclear power plants, even with Diablo Canyon. They put on the seismic supports the wrong direction and had to go in and, totally redo them. All right, so let's start with the development phase. The first step in development is site selection. Let's brainstorm this. What do you guys think are some of the most important factors in siting a wind and solar project? Access to the grid, yeah, transmission capacity, or if not access to the grid, then proximity to demand too. like with a solar project, it's very modular. You can put it on a roof or right next to demand, but access to the grid is really important because you, by and large, cannot, it's very hard to find instances where you can site your renewable energy project right next to where the demand is. And even then, you might still need the grid, to use basically as an energy storage, right? Because the demand center load profile might not necessarily align perfectly with the wind or solar generation. Yeah, road infrastructure, super important if you're talking about wind turbines. Anyone here from like the Midwest? Yeah, have you guys ever seen wind turbine blades being transmitted on a truck? Yeah, I mean, they're long, right? And if there's like a hill with a vertical difference on either side, like that truck could get stuck. Or too sharp of a turn, very important. Certainly, the resource is a really important factor in site selection, more important for wind energy than for solar. These maps, they show the wind energy resource in the US on the left and the solar energy resource on the right. For the wind energy resource, the darker purple colors, you can see there's a lot of resource in the Midwest corridor and the Great Plains. There are also pockets of good wind energy resource elsewhere, like in the Altamont Pass in California, just east of here. But by and large, wind energy project development is concentrated in the Midwest and in those very specific pockets, like the Altamont Pass. You can see, there's not a lot of wind energy resource in the Southeast. And because of that, we haven't seen a lot of wind energy development there. But for solar, based on this map, you might think that, solar development has largely concentrated in the Southwest. And that certainly was the case early in the development of the solar market. But today we're seeing solar project development happen everywhere, even in the Pacific Northwest and Maine. And that's because a couple different reasons. First, the technology has gotten to a point where you can economically develop a solar project, sufficiently productive solar project pretty much everywhere. And also because solar is much more modular, right? You can site it on somebody's roof for a 5 kilowatt project, or you could do, 100, 200, 300 megawatt project that's utility scale ground mount. And the way that we figure out how much resources is in a given location, we can certainly look at maps like these. In the case of wind energy, you definitely want to measure site-specific wind energy resource using a met tower with an anemometer and whatnot, because local terrain can really impact the wind energy, including at different levels of height. For solar, these maps like that come out of NREL are really good for assessing the solar resource at any given point. But you definitely have to figure out local kind of shading constraints, right? Where, if you're looking at a building, is there a building next to it that might shade it? If you're in the northern hemisphere, like on the southern side in particular, or could a building be built there in the future? Is that likely? Or if you're talking about utility scale ground mount, are there hills nearby? Or, do you have a flat enough surface so that the solar panels aren't shading each other at different points of the day? Another big consideration with site selection we talked about proximity to population. Oftentimes, different municipal areas have like setbacks within which, a wind project has to be sited a certain distance away from where the population is. But also importantly, there are environmental constraints to consider. We didn't talk about that during our brainstorm. NREL does a regular assessment of the technically recoverable wind energy resource in the US. And this map here shows areas of the US that they excluded because of various constraints like where cities are located, but importantly, where there are sensitive environmental lands or water. And you see that there are a significant amount of what they call sensitive environmental lands in the West, where wind energy can't be developed because it's, a national park or, other protected lands. For wind energy development, you also have to consider other environmental factors like bird migrations. When you visit the Altamont Pass project, NextEra's project, oftentimes NextEra will bring out their biologists that they have on staff who's really just focused on making sure that the wind turbines don't harm birds, and in particular raptors. And they brought in on consultants even during the development of those projects to better site the wind turbines to avoid those bird migratory patterns. So it's a really significant factor when you're thinking about renewable energy project development. And there have been projects that just don't move forward because there's a sensitive, species that would be impacted. This is a map from the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy has an initiative that's really focused on siting renewables right, and as part of that, they've developed maps where they show areas that have those environmental sensitivities, like certain sensitive birds or bats or protected lands. And so this is a map that they developed as a tool for renewable energy project developers to use to identify those lower impact areas for development. As you can see, there are a lot of areas that they would prefer not to see development. So it's a challenge, right? Where you've got, sometimes you see opposition for renewable energy project development from entrenched fossil fuel interests or conservatives who just don't want to see renewable energy happen, but you also can see opposition from environmentalists who don't want to see renewable energy projects impacting the environment and wildlife. It comes back to what we talked about earlier, the fact that there's no free lunch, right? All renewable energy resources have an environmental impact. All right, we talked about site selection and the importance of access to the grid. So another important factor when choosing your site is availability of transmission capacity to transport electricity generated to the sources of demand. So as a renewable energy project developer, you might look for several things. Ideally, new projects would be able to take advantage of existing transmission capacity or distribution infrastructure that's not already being used at full capacity. If you can't find that, a new project could be sited in an area where new transmission is being built. And we see a lot of efforts for new transmission, particularly with a focus on transmitting renewable energy to load. And then the third option is to target areas where power plants are actually going to retire and open up capacity on existing transmission lines. We're seeing a lot of retirements of thermal generation in the US. Some really, really big power plants that are really opening up large amounts of capacity. That's one of the things where at Jane's company, where I worked for several years, we had a strategy specifically focused on where these coal-fired and nuclear-fired power plants were retiring, tying up land and developing wind and solar projects to take advantage of that existing transmission. We called it the sinks strategy because it was where transmission sinks were opening up. All right, another important consideration in site selection that we didn't talk about is what price you can get for electricity for your project. As we talked about in the grid lecture, wholesale electricity prices vary by location, depending on where demand is located relative to supply and whether or not there's sufficient transmission capacity in between those. Generally, you want to target development on a site at a node where you can get the best price, right? So where there is either more demand than supply, or sufficient transmission capacity to transport your supply to where demand is located. And that pricing dynamic can change too, right? A lot of the early wind energy developers in West Texas, they must not have anticipated the fact that a bunch of supply would flood into West Texas and create congestion on those transmission lines, resulting in a recurring negative pricing environment. And there have certainly been efforts to build out the transmission capacity between West Texas and areas of demand, but typically renewable energy project development has outstripped those efforts. Related to the price that you can get for electricity, another consideration in site selection is whether or not you're located in a competitive electricity market. Because if you're in a regulated state where there's one monopoly utility who controls the supply generation mix, then you only have one buyer for electricity from your project, right? Which, it could work if you know that your utility is planning to procure renewable energy. It could also work if there's what's called a green tariff in a regulated market. Green tariffs allow utility customers, like bigger ones, like Apple or and whatnot, to buy electricity from a particular power plant, kind of like what Stanford is doing in with their solar projects. There are about 10 states that have successful green tariff programs. One in particular that I want to call out is North Carolina. So North Carolina is not a part of an ISO or RTO. They don't have a competitive wholesale electricity market, but they have seen a bunch of utility scale solar development because they've had such a successful green tariff program. But generally, we saw a lot of renewable energy project development concentrated in these ISO and RTO markets where there's projects have much more flexibility for who they sell their power to because there's this open, competitive wholesale electricity market. Another factor in site selection is, where is demand happening? For a long time, as you've learned in this class, electricity demand in the US has been fairly flat. But we have seen a lot of growth, and we anticipate more growth with those trends in electrification, but also in specific industries, like in data centers. But also, anticipating where new demand is happening because of population trends, like this map that you see on the left from the Census Bureau, where you see, the US has seen a lot of population growth in areas like Florida, the Phoenix area, Houston, Dallas-Fort Worth areas. Because of that, those specific areas are also seeing population growth. Okay, last consideration for site selection is whether or not you have policy support for renewable energy growth in an area. That can also drive demand for renewable energy. And a big policy to understand that's present in a lot of states across the US is called a Renewable Portfolio Standard, or an RPS. And these are legally mandated targets within states for how much electricity has to come from renewable resources. Several states, you can see, 30 states and DC have renewable portfolio standards. And, I think the first RPS was put in place in like the 80s. But we've seen several states increase their RPS standards just in the last decade because of the trends that we've been talking about, both accelerating climate change and decreasing costs for wind and solar. But we've also seen 15 states that have announced 100% clean energy targets. And in some cases, 100% renewable energy targets. And I'll talk about the distinction in a minute. But that includes California, New York, Virginia, and Washington. So what resources qualify for the renewable or clean energy targets actually varies by state because of what we talked about earlier. Different renewable energy resources have different environmental impacts. So in California, hydro large hydro doesn't count towards the 60% renewable energy target by 2030 that California has as part of its RPS. However, going beyond 60% to the 100% clean energy target by 2045, large hydro can count towards that, as well as what they call net zero non-renewable energy resources, like nuclear power and natural gas with carbon capture and storage. But regardless, a takeaway I hope you have from this map is that there are a lot of really aggressive renewables and clean energy targets across the US that are helping to drive demand for these renewable energy resources. Let's talk about, move past site selection and talk about the next step in the project development process after you've identified your site is tying up the land. You saw this table in the environment lecture, but it gives you a sense of how much land is needed for different electricity resources. A wind energy project, it needs quite a bit of land. Because of that, but not all of the land is necessarily used for the wind technology and equipment, right? You can use land in between the wind turbines and the substation for things like agriculture, raising crops or tending livestock and growing crops and whatnot. So typically what we see with wind projects is that they'll lease the land from, say, a farmer or whoever the landowner is, because it's still being used for these other activities. In the case of solar, however, there's much like a smaller amount of land relatively to wind that's needed for the solar panels. But by and large, you can only really use it for the solar panels. There's some really cool examples of solar being used, for kind of low light agricultural crop growing, and for grazing in between the solar panels. There's also some dual use for solar, putting them on roofs or putting them on reservoirs to reduce evaporation. But anyway, by and large, utility scale projects. The land typically can't be used for something else. So sometimes project developers will lease the land, but often they'll just buy it outright because given that it can't be used for anything else. Okay, we talked about getting land rights through leases or buying the land. Another really important step in the project development process is getting permits. All businesses need to get permits to operate. And depending on the type of project, there might be local permitting processes that apply. There might be state or even federal permitting processes. And the permits needed, they might vary depending on the project, and they could pertain to everything from environmental impacts to land use, FAA regulations, safety regulations, particularly in the context of nuclear. But to give two examples here, a big consideration for wind energy projects is whether your turbines might interfere with FAA communications and radar infrastructure. So all wind energy projects need to register their turbines and get permits from the FAA. All projects also need to conduct, at least utility scale, need to conduct an environmental impact assessment as part of their local permitting process. And to give an example of the permitting hurdles that might come up, there's a concentrating solar project in the Mojave Desert called Ivanpah. I should put the picture of us at Ivanpah. Diana and I were on a road trip and we drove by it, and of course we hopped out and took pictures. If you guys are ever out on road trips, always take that opportunity. You never know when you're gonna be able to whip that out and tell a story. So yeah, Ivanpah is a concentrating solar project that was built in the Mojave Desert in 2014, and it turns out that that project was located on a site full of endangered desert tortoises. So in 2010, construction of the project was temporarily put on hold, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had to assess the impacts of the project on the local desert tortoise population. The project, which had a total $2.2 billion budget, spent $60 million relocating these desert tortoises. And ultimately, the project was scaled back in size to avoid additional impacts on those desert tortoises. So it gives you a sense of how important this permitting process can be in determining the success and the costs of a project, and how important siting is as well, to ensure that you're not going to be at a location where you're impacting local wildlife at that level. This is a picture I took of a very big solar project. The desert tortoise impact is like really important for utility scale development in the desert in general, in Nevada and in portions of California. I visited the early stage development site of the Gemini Solar Project, which is a huge solar and storage project outside of Las Vegas. It's complete today, but when I visited early last year, all that was there, they had basically, cleared out the area and cleared out all the desert tortoises, and then they had just this little fence that tall to make sure that the tortoises didn't get back into the development site. It's kind of cute. So permitting is often the point during which local kind of NIMBY and banana interests can surface. Because the permitting process, it can involve a period of public comment when locals, environmentalists, environmental justice groups can get involved and say, hey, I don't want this plant built, and they can lobby their local politicians or community members to oppose the project. And as I mentioned, this can and is often a big hurdle to renewable energy project development. Because of this, it's really important for renewable energy project developers to engage communities early on in the development process and listen to what they need and how they want to be involved. And in fact, one of the best practices that has developed more recently in the renewable energy project development space are what are called community benefits agreements, which are legally binding agreements that are a part of renewable energy project development process that specify how the project is going to provide benefits to the community, whether you're talking about labor benefits and hiring local workers and training local workers to construct the project, or funding community projects like schools or parks, or funds to support local environmental initiatives, kind of like environmental offsets for the project. And this is actually, for example, a lot of the funding that's coming down from the federal government in the form of grants for renewable energy projects, that they require these types of community benefits projects. Another type of permit that projects need to get is an interconnection agreement. You have to get permission from the grid operator to interconnect into the grid by applying for this interconnection agreement. The grid operator manages this interconnection process, the so-called interconnection queue. So that would be the RTO or ISO if the region has one, or if not, it would be the utility. So the interconnection queue process for utility scale projects can take quite a bit of time, at least a year and a half, sometimes more, as you can see in this interconnection queue kind of timeline from PJM, which is one of the Eastern RTOs. So the process, it typically involves the grid operator conducting multiple studies to assess the technical feasibility of the project and the impact that the project would have on the grid, and any transmission system upgrades that might need to be required. And the ultimate objective of the grid operator in conducting these studies is ensuring the reliability of the grid if this project were to interconnect and come online, and just making sure that the lights don't go off. But interconnection processes and interconnection queues, you've probably heard there's a lot of congestion in the interconnection queues. There's a lot of projects, long wait times, and there are a lot of efforts by ISOs and RTOs to kind of streamline these processes because it can be a big hurdle to achieving our clean electricity and renewable energy targets across the US. So electric utilities are one potential customer for a project. As we talked about in the grid lecture, one way to gauge whether or not a utility is going to want a renewable energy project is by looking at their integrated resource plans. This is an integrated resource plan from NIPSCO, the Northern Indiana Public Service Company, which is in Indiana, doesn't have an RPS, but really cool 2018 integrated resource plan here where They announced their plans to basically go from 72% coal capacity in 2018 to 0 in 2028, and replacing it with a combination of solar, wind, and other renewable energy resources. So you definitely know NIPSCO is going to want some renewable energy resources. Another potential buyer are big corporates and other kind of individual utility customers that have aggressive renewable energy targets and big demand. So those non-utility customers like Facebook, Google, Stanford, federal and local governments too are increasingly procuring renewable energy directly. To give you a sense of scale and the significance of these non-utility buyers, non-utility customers executed PPAs with wind and solar projects totaling about 20 gigawatts in 2022. The wind and solar capacity, total wind and solar capacity brought online in 2022 was 19 gigawatts. So really, really significant sources of demand. If an electric utility is a customer for a project, they might buy the project outright from the developer and own it and rate base it. But if not, the project developer or other independent power producer could sell the power via a long-term contract with the utility known as a power purchase agreement, which is a multi-year agreement between a power plant owner and the customer or the off-taker, in which the price of electricity is agreed upon in advance. It could be fixed, it could have escalators baked in, it could be tied to, a hub price. But PPAs are also how, these non-utility customers would enter into an agreement with a renewable energy project. And we talked a little bit about PPAs for the grid lecture, so I won't spend too much time on that. Power plants could also operate on a merchant basis if they're located in a competitive wholesale electricity market, and they can just sell power into the wholesale market on an hour-by-hour or day-to-day basis. One of the potential downsides of that is, you're exposed to price volatility on the market, right? So you could be exposed to price downsides if prices are lower than you expect, but you could also get exposed to price upside. For example, if you were an uncontracted wind energy asset in West Texas, you had a lot of price downside if you didn't have a PPA price associated with your project. All right, another way that renewable energy projects can get paid separate from these processes that we just talked about is through what are called renewable energy certificates, or RECs. So electricity that is generated from a renewable energy project actually has two components. One is the physical electricity that's generated, and the second is the renewable or green characteristics of that renewable energy. And those two characteristics are valued separately in markets. So hypothetically, if I'm a wind or solar project, I can sell my electricity into a wholesale power market, and separately, I could sell the RECs to a potential buyer. The bulk of demand for RECs in the US is driven by those renewable portfolio standards that I talked about, the RPSs, where one way that utilities or other independent power producers can comply with their state's renewable portfolio standard is by buying RECs. Let's say a utility doesn't want to retire their natural gas plant because they need that flexible power source, or they want to keep making money off of it. Instead of retiring it and building a new renewable energy project, they can instead go to the REC market and buy renewable energy certificates from another project. Could be in-state or out-of-state, depending on RPS regulations and standards. A good portion of the REC market, though, is also driven by voluntary renewable energy targets set by, for example, large corporations. Apple has a voluntary 100% renewable energy target, and they met the bulk of this by buying wind and solar directly, and in some instances, even building their own wind and solar projects. But for a small portion of meeting that, they ended up having to buy RECs because their operations were in a market that wasn't competitive wholesale electricity market, so it was hard for them to enter into a PPA with a project, or whatever the case may be. I want to end by talking about financing your renewable energy project. And renewable energy projects typically have a combination of, like all infrastructure projects, equity and debt. But renewable energy projects have this interesting component of the capital stack called tax equity investors. And so I want to focus on tax credits because they are such a significant consideration for renewable energy projects, whether you're talking about utility scale or distributed. And with the Inflation Reduction Act, they actually extended tax credits and increased them. We thought that the wind and solar tax credits prior to the Inflation Reduction Act were sunsetting, but the Inflation Reduction Act extended that. And the IRA also included a lot of other tax credits for things like domestic manufacturing of batteries and critical minerals, for CCS and whatnot. But I want to, and those tax credits as a whole make up over 75% of the federal clean energy funds that are coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act. So tax credits are huge. And they're uncapped. In the case of wind and solar tax credits, the amount that actually flows for those projects just depends on how many projects get built. So that's an interesting aspect of the Inflation Reduction Act, where the more we build, the more federal funding we're going to be able to deploy towards accelerating the clean energy transition. So the Lazard LCOE analysis that we show you are unsubsidized. They don't take into account these tax credits, but this chart shows you the impact from Lazard. It shows you the impact on levelized cost of energy of these federal tax credits. So they're pretty significant. You can get anywhere from a tax credit of 6%, covering 6% of the cost of a project, up to 70% of the cost of a project. So historically, prior to the IRA, there were two different types of tax credits, the investment tax credit and the production tax credit. And historically, the investment tax credit, or the ITC, had been most relevant for solar, and the production tax credit, the PTC, was available to wind energy. But the IRA changed that. It allowed wind and solar projects to elect which tax credit they want between the investment tax credit or the production tax credit. So, to understand the significance of that, let's talk about the difference between the two. An investment tax credit gives you a credit for the portion of the cost of building a project. So let's say your project costs $100 million. You accessed a 30% ITC, then you can get a $30 million tax credit for your project. But a production tax credit, by contrast, is $1 per megawatt hour amount over the life or a certain amount of time that the project is operating. It's somewhat arbitrary. Well, one is an investment tax credit and one is a production tax credit. But you can imagine that if you have if your project has higher capital costs and lower productivity, you're going to want the investment tax credit. But if your project has relatively lower capital costs and higher productivity, you're going to want the production tax credit, by and large. General rule of thumb, obviously there are exceptions to that depending on the structures of the different projects and the tax liability of the customer and whatnot. All right, but generally production tax credit incentivizes higher productivity, which is a good thing, right? Okay, so let's go back to this concept of tax equity investors. Historically, a project owner would need to have a tax appetite in the form of taxable income in order to monetize the tax credits, the ITC or the PTC. But in many instances, a project owner doesn't have sufficient tax equity. Maybe it's a newer company that doesn't have a lot of income, or it's a non-taxable entity, a tribe, a nonprofit, a local government, a state or local government. Prior to the IRA, if a city or a school built renewable energy project, they wouldn't be able to take advantage of these tax credits. But the Inflation Reduction Act implemented a really game-changing policy mechanism called direct pay or elective pay, whereby non-taxable entities like schools, governments, tribes can file with the IRS and get a cash payment in the form of, in the amount of the credit. So that's been a big game changer. The IRA also implemented something called transferability, which allows taxable entities to just sell their tax credits to somebody else without having to find a big tax equity investor. It's rather hard to do. You know, there are two main tax equity investors in the US that dominate about 50% of the tax equity market. It's Bank of America and JP Morgan, and they'll only do deals over $100 million, right? So this allows kind of the smaller players, even if you're taxable, to kind of more easily sell your tax credits without having to find a tax equity investor and structure, you know, a complicated partnership flip structure that allows you to monetize the tax credit. So it's great the IRA made these tax credit mechanisms a little bit more efficient and effective. And then finally, the IRA put in place a tiered credit amounts to incentivize projects to meet minimum labor standards and domestic content requirements, and also in the case of the ITC, to incentivize projects to serve low-income customers, particularly because renewable energy, at least historically, has been something that's been more available to higher income portions of the population. So this is a little bit complicated. You know, I'd say use it more for reference, but in the case of the ITC, if you're under a megawatt, you don't, you know, at the top, you don't have to meet the labor requirements. You can get 30% tax credit, you know, base on a project. And then you can get these adders, the 10% for meeting domestic content minimums, another 10% if you're in an energy community, which is, you know, a census tract that's adjacent to, say, where a coal-fired power plant has recently retired and impacted the economy and employment in that area. And then you can get adders for low income, like if you're an affordable housing development and you're using that rooftop solar project to benefit your tenants. Those adders or bonuses you have to apply for, and they're limited. We've been helping our affordable housing developers apply for this in Nevada. And then, you know, the structure changes if you're a bigger utility scale project that's over a megawatt. You know, significant difference between the base credit if you meet those labor requirements like prevailing wage versus if you don't. So this is the investment tax credit. And this is the structure for the wind production, for the production tax credit, which can be used for wind or solar. The structure is kind of similar to the investment tax credit. You just don't see those low income bonuses. All right, so that's renewable energy.